Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. This is a first stream of the new year for me. For us, I think the whole
I
team.
think it is. I think it's the
Um,
first stream of the new year for Reclaim.
yeah. So, I mean, with that in mind, I think we figured. I think two things. So we're going to talk a little today about stuff I personally I've been messing around on break with, um, and but also I think as always for the year, it's centered around a blog post in some ways, right?
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
so
Yeah, it's all about the blog.
yeah, so I'm gonna get my screen shared here real quick. Um, but what I've been playing with recently has is this tool called RetroNAS, and um, for anyone who's watching this who has never messed around with emulation or retro computing or like retro video games, we're digging right in the weeds. so I apologize in some ways, but this is sort of a tool to help someone who likes to mess with those things make their life simpler in some ways. That's kind of how I view this thing. And so it does a couple things. I blogged about, hey, I'm trying this project out. It's a relatively small, it's been around for a little while, but it's a relatively small project. It's got a GitHub. This YouTube video is a pretty good explainer if folks want to watch it later. But basically, it's sort of an all-in-one solution for managing your tools for emulation and working with old devices and networking them, basically. So it does a couple different things. And only one of them have I even been able to mess with so far, but there's a few things I'm going to dig into and we'll talk about today. I'm excited to mess with. But the first thing it really does is it gives you a neat place to organize a collection of ROMs, which ROMs are software that you can emulate for these old platforms, basically.
Which is huge because depending upon what device, what computer you're on, and if you're doing basically emulating these old video games or whatever, you don't know which bag of ROMs you have on any given device. And you then have to go around and look for ROMs, and having one centralized network space for your ROMs, because I use a whole bunch of different devices. I use a RetroPie. I use something called a Batocera now. My son has a uh, Steam Deck. So
Mm-hmm.
he has a whole series of ROMs now. And so, like, we need a centralized place for our ROMs. My question to you, and I'm getting ahead of myself, is I have a home office and I have an office in downtown Trento.
Mm-hmm.
Can I also network it between two locations, IP based?
Yeah. So technically, there are ways to do that, and it gets further in the weeds. But you could do it one of two ways, which we can talk about at a high level, and we can dig into the specifics if you want to. But you could either have one of these that you maintain in both places, and you could use tools like rsync to make sure that they're the same in both places. Which, you know, Jim and I working in web hosting, we're
Yeah.
rsync things all the
You
time.
know,
It could be a scary tool. You could do a lot of damage with it if you don't know what you're doing, but it's also a really powerful tool to make one set of files the same as another set of files. That'd be one way you could do it. Another thing you could do though, this might require some more networking voodoo magic, but you could use things like Tailscale or a VPN actually to sort of bridge your home network and your office network for this purpose and maybe just this purpose. Now, the tricky thing with that is you what you would want is you'd have sort of one RetroNAS probably at home. Well, it doesn't really matter. You'd probably put it wherever your internet is best if you have internet connection in both places. I'm
sure.
assuming. And then you would need a device on the other network that can talk to the RetroNAS and essentially um, t- we do a little bit of this stuff as well at work, but it allows you to take two connections and bridge certain devices between them. Now, the caveat with that is that's the thing you have to set up, and B, if your internet connection is not real good, it might be kind of slow. So that's the trick with that. I probably would just set up 2 of these on Raspberry Pis and use rsync to make sure that they're the same. That's probably what I would do.
So just a script, one reaching out to another.
Yeah, and then you keep in your mind,
it.
this is my master one, essentially. Like this is the one. You know what this is? This is ROM multi-region.
Yeah, but like, let's just say, does it work both ways? So let's just say I have the master at home, but I'm adding ROMs at work. It doesn't copy both ways.
You would have to. It could, but as you know, like rsync has a concept of source and destination.
Yeah.
Right. And so what you would have to do is remember which one. So if you're adding ROMs at the office, you better run that rsync to bring them home, because otherwise they may get overwritten later.
That's where you run into major problems, though.
Exactly.
That's where you potentially, overwrite all the ROMs you shared. You upload it to home or vice versa.
And what I would do, probably, again, there's 2 ways to handle this. If you are the type of person that can keep this in your head, you could have a sync, like a script that you have on each thing, and just say, I just fire that script off whenever I add ROMs from wherever I am, and then it's always in sync. That's fine. Or what I would probably do is you could set up remote SFTP on the master one and just make it a habit of, I use my FTP client, I use Transmit or CyberDuck or whatever to always drop ROMs in the main one, and then I sync from in one direction. That's probably what I would do, because I am terrible at remembering, like, time wise. Oh, when was the last time I added ROM? And again, there are a lot of ways to handle this. Another thing you could do, Jim, if this is a Raspberry Pi, you could just bring it to wherever you are, right? Yeah, you could just pack it up and have an Ethernet cable ready or whatever in one place, and then bring it back and forth. Less than ideal. And then finally, we'll talk. There's some other things, ways to do this too. So, because I'll show you what this is, what the execution of this is. But the interesting thing for me is, to me, this is a little bit like Plex. If folks have used Plex for maintaining a digital video library, it's like Plex for emulation kind of. It's not as fancy looking. Like Plex has a whole like interface, and it tries to get box art and stuff like that. It's not really doing that, working at that level, but it does do things like automatically sort things for you, and things like that. Like, one of my favorite things I've messed with this so far is you can just give it a folder of ROMs to chew through and run this tool called ROM import, and it will actually checksum each file. So it will basically get a hash of, like, this is the contents of the file, a representation of it, and check it against a database on GitHub that somebody else maintains. And then it will sort it and go, oh, we know this is a ROM for the NES, and it's this particular game, and we're going to put it in this folder for you. It's really cool.
That is cool, actually.
So that's what I'm kind of working through with it right now. So, okay. So this thing is, again, it's basically a operating system you can run, but it's kind of simple. It's Debian Linux, which is a very, very, very popular distribution of Linux. And it's some Ansible playbooks that they run, which is an interesting crossover with what we do at work. We use Ansible to pretty much any company that deals with Linux uses Ansible to manage their servers. This is Ansible applied to a hobbyist project, basically. So you don't have to like have an Ansible server or anything like that. It's all local. But it's kind of interesting because I've been digging through this and just seeing how it works and recognizing some things.
You're really warming up to your sysadmin identity now. Ansible, I love it.
Well, this is a pattern for me in my life and career. I think my first experiences with Linux were getting an old computer to work in high school, and then I absolutely wiped it on accident. And later on in college, maintaining a Minecraft server. So, and a lot of the things that I've learned since then, I can trace all the way back to maintaining a Minecraft server on some old computer for a few friends, basically. So, um, anyway, and this is just another case of that in a lot of ways. And my first experience with rsync was trying to solve this problem we're talking about today, and I can even show that. But I had this big script. So the problem that you already kind of outlined, but I'll reiterate here, is if you have ROMs and things to emulate, and you have a large amount of them, maybe you've started collecting them over time, things like that. It can be really annoying to make sure that this works with all of the devices you may want to use them on. You mentioned you're using Raspberry Pi with. It never occurred to me that Batocera should be pronounced that way. I've never heard it spoken out loud, but like,
No,
yeah,
it's they say
Italian.
Batocera,
Okay.
but no, it's actually like a beetle, like some sort of
Oh.
beetle, and it's Latin. But
Oh.
I think
Okay.
if you were in Italy, you'd say Batocera, right? But I
Hmm.
just get confused because now my C is, I'm never confident about C's.
Sure.
So Batocera is how everyone pretty much pronounce it.
Okay.
So I'm not, and I say it both ways just because I'm never sure. So
Sure.
don't trust me, in other words.
Yeah, so there's that you're using with some actual hardware in some cases. You mentioned Steam Deck, and Steam Deck has several different pieces of software that you could use for emulation. I'm in a similar boat. My main things I'm using are a Mr. FPGA, a which we've talked about on Reclaim TV before, a Analog Pocket, which is another FPGA device, but it's a recreation of a Game Boy, basically. And it can play a couple different systems, actually, but it's a form factor of a Game Boy. Actually, I thought I had it handy here, but it's in my closet right now. And then also a little handheld, little tiny, it's like literally this big, called the Miu Mini. And it runs RetroArch under the hood, basically, which is a very common, I'll call it like platform. It's like a bunch of different emulators. It is what Batocera uses under the hood. It is
Also
what
RetroPie.
Yeah, it's what RetroPie uses under the hood. It's what a lot of the things you'll run into on Steam Deck. And I don't do this a lot, but should I want to emulate a game just directly on my computer, it's probably what I would use there too. So
Yeah.
the problem with these things is if you have a collection of ROMs and you want to use them in all those places, what are your options, right? You can store them maybe on your computer in a bunch of folders and be meticulous about organizing them, and then like use USB flash drives to move them around, or you could, copy some of them over the network to those devices. But as you add to that collection, it gets very difficult to know, did I put that game
Yeah,
on this device or not, basically.
I agree.
Um, that gets really out of hand, and it gets even trickier because none of these devices use the same folder names. And usually you have to put a ROM, like say you've got a ROM for the Nintendo Entertainment System, in RetroArch, it wants you to put that in a folder called Nintendo Entertainment System. And on Mr., it's actually in a folder called Famicom, because that's what it was called in Japan, and they just went with that as the name. And on this thing, it's yet another naming convention.
Like NES, right?
Yes, yeah, just NES all lowercase is a common, right? So
Yeah.
that, again, if you're only dealing with a few of these things, you can figure it out by looking, right, and just manually copying. But that is a laborious process to keep that updated everywhere. This is very much a first world problem, but I've spent a lot of time collecting these ROMs. I want them to be easy to use on whatever device I want to use them on, and in my case it's like 3 different devices. That gets pretty complicated. The way I've solved this in the past is I have my own folder convention that I use, which is just kind of similar, but not the same as any of them. It's just what Taylor's decided when he was organizing things. And then I set up an rsync script that will like go and put, but I manually have, it's like 300 lines long. I manually say, put this folder over here on this device, and this folder over here on that device, and this folder over here on that device.
Wow.
As you can imagine, that takes some doing. And then once in a while, one of these projects will say, actually, we're going to rename the folder. And I go, God damn it. Now I have to go back to my
Absolutely.
script and update it, right? And frankly, because of the reality of that script, it's never quite done. Like I've never fully finished it. It's always like working on this device and not on this one.
Yeah.
And I have to manually boot up all of these devices and hit the go button because they all have to be on at the same time for this sync to happen. It's not a good solution. Or at least one of them has to be on and whatever. So it's not great. I learned a lot about rsync making it a long time
Exactly.
ago.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to see your rsync script. That sounds impressive.
It's I think I have it publicly on GitHub. It's called ROM sync, and it's basically a bunch of these are the devices I have set up, and I've basically set up a bunch of variables. So it'll be like, all right, sync copy ROM from my server this folder to the Mister this folder, and so each supported ROM collection I have to manually add in here. And in my case, 5 different times for the different devices I support, right? And I have to go check because I don't know off the top of my head. So right, I have to like turn my Mister on, look at the file system, go, it looks like this is the right one. It's a mess kind of. And what I've done,
run that script from?
I run this from my server. So my server, I have a old computer, old desktop in my basement that has a couple hard drives in it, and it's just a file server. It also runs Plex and a couple things for me. It's on all the time. And so this script sits on my server, and I run this. And what it basically does is it will ping my Mister, and if the Mister responds, it'll go, cool, we can copy ROMs to it. If the Mister doesn't respond, it doesn't do anything, and it just moves on to the next device in its list. So this works.
Do you have problems with your devices maybe not connecting? Because one of the things with Raspberry Pi that can be very frustrating is the IP seems to change regularly when you're doing wireless, and you have to kind of, SSH or SFTP into it. And so then, you spend a lot of time just chasing down the IP, and it's never consistent unless it has an Ethernet cable. But a lot of these new ones, which are zero and small and cheap, $15, but you have to go in through wireless.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is good. We are building up all the reasons why someone might want to try RetroNAS instead of doing what we are talking about right now. But so the way I solve that problem is usually these devices have you can also connect to them via a host name, something like rpi.lan or rpi.local. Now you have to find out what that is. And in some cases that's not enabled. Like on the Mister, that's not enabled out of the box. And I could probably figure out how to enable that. But what I actually do is I go in my router, and in most routers, if you have a fancy one or just the one that your internet provider provides you, they all have an option to assign a static IP to a device. So I give a static IP to these 5 devices, basically. My home server.
That's what I should do. That's good.
And then further tie into our day jobs here, I actually go on my cPanel, or you could do this in Cloudflare, whatever DNS provider, and I assign a subdomain to that IP. Now, this is not publicly accessible. It's not web pages or anything. But what it means is I can type in and go mr.jaden.me, and that will resolve to my Mister's IP address on my local network.
But that's a local network IP, so it won't be on the web. Got it.
Yeah, well, technically, if you try to visit that right now, it'll try to go to, I think my Mister's IP is something like 192.168.1.104, I don't remember off the top of my head because I don't have to. It will try to go to whatever that device is on your network, right? This is not, I'm using DNS because I'm comfortable with it, but it's not useful off of my home network because that's a different device on yours, right? But it's a thing you can do, and it's agnostic to, people do a version of this on larger networks for enterprise networking, where they have their own local DNS server that responds and stuff like that. I don't need to do any of that because I have my own domain and I can use the DNS tools attached to it, right? So
brilliant. That's cool.
So what I have in here, and you can see this in my script, I have these outlined. So actually, in my case, it's I have a subdomain called home, which points to my home IP address, and then Um, I do further ones under that is my convention, but you could just assign a static IP and put it right in a file like this and be done. I just kind of like doing it in this way where I don't have to remember an IP or anything like that. So now this is a mess to maintain, and I'll tell you right now, I'm pretty sure I don't have it working on my Steam Deck. And like I have entries in here, but they're not correct, and it's in progress, you know. And so what I'm looking to do is ditch this. This is just becoming too much to maintain. And it's not great because I also have to actively sync. I still have to remember when I add a new ROM to sync. And there are ways that make this much easier with something like RetroNAS. So first thing is it gives you one place that it creates for you to collect your ROMs. And then secondly, it can present those ROMs in different formats and directory paths for whatever device you're using. And third, it's a network service. So certain things, not everything, but certain things of these devices, you can actually just directly mount that storage over the network and it will read it. My Mister is an example of this. I can put in the settings that RetroNAS comes up for me and just mount my ROM library. I don't need to sync anything to the device. It's just over the network going and getting those ROMs.
Nice.
And for retro emulation, even Wi-Fi in most cases is going to be plenty fast for loading this. This is what, you know, you have to keep in mind most of these things we're talking about a ROM that's a megabyte or way less in a lot of cases, kilobytes, you know. So it's just not a big deal. Now the Mister can go up to like PlayStation, which is discs, CDs, and I've tried that, and even that over Wi-Fi seems to work fine.
It works.
It's not downloading the whole thing all at once. It's kind of streaming it, but that's also how a CD would work, right? Your CD doesn't load into the memory of the console. It's seeking. Even CDs aren't really that fast compared to modern networking. So. Anyway, so at least for my home network over Wi-Fi, I guess I could plug my Mister in. I do have Ethernet in this room, but right now it's just on Wi-Fi and it works fine. So I'm sticking with that. And it means I can also pick that device up and bring it to another place in my house if I want to, really easily. So, but then there's another thing too. So if you wanted to, you could use this capability for it to present your ROM collection in different things. And you could still just use that as a really easy way to organize and still manually copy whatever you want to over, but it would be in one go, right? So you're copying one folder from here to your destination. So this could be another thing you could do is you could just say, I run RetroNAS at home, and for my one Raspberry Pi, I bring it home every couple months and sync to make sure it has the correct, you know, ROM library. That's probably the most sensible solution that we've described here. So what this actually looks like, I'm going to share a different window now. And this is just my Mac, in the Finder, but, so this is how this looks on my network. So I set this RetroNAS thing up, and it automatically makes a network share that's called Retro SMB, and it's got a RetroNAS share. And there's a bunch of things in here. There's a place to like mess with the configuration.
Can you also share all your BIOS files across your various?
It gives you a place to collect them, but I think. The BIOS files are not represented in this ROM. I think you still would have to manually copy these over, as far as I know. But it does give you a way. As you can see here, it's even pre-populated some folders. So it's like, here's where you'd put your Atari 2600 BIOS if it needs that, or you know, they're all organized by company.
Usually needs them.
Gotcha. There is ROMs, and this is a folder it made for me where I can throw my ROMs, and these are really all-encompassing. So it basically will have a company name, and then you can dig into systems that they have made. So if I go to like Nintendo here, it'll be like, cool,
Jesus.
Are you talking 3DS, DS, DSi, e-reader, Famicom, which is Japanese NES, NES? Wow, it has the this is a prototype console that was never released. It has a folder for that, I guess, called Nintendo PlayStation.
PlayStation.
Kind of famously, Sony burned them on, or Nintendo burned Sony on that deal, and then Sony went and made their own thing called the PlayStation.
Wow.
So, Nintendo 64, 64DD, which is a disk drive for the Nintendo 64, was never released in the West, right? There's some obscure stuff in here. Now, I don't have ROMs for most of these obscure things, but if I did, I'd put them in that folder.
Got it.
So that's thing one. Then you go in the RetroNAS software, which we'll show in a little bit, and you basically say, cool, I want to share for my other devices, And so I told it to make one for the Mister. I told it to make one for RetroArch, which is that underlying emulation software that a lot of things uses. And I told it to make one for my Analog Pocket. So if I go into, let's go with RetroArch, because this is, I think, the nicest one. RetroArch uses a layout like this, where it has a bunch of folders, and I should make this smaller, actually, so it's easier to see. It has a bunch of folders, and they're usually with the convention of like company name dash console. And so you can see here, Atari 2600. If I go in there, this is my ROMs for the Atari 2600. And this is how it organized them for me. So you'll see that it made like folders for the US, A through M and N through Z.
It's crazy.
And it takes a little bit to load. Mac OS is real slow with network shares in my experience, so that's just kind of annoying. But this takes a little bit to load. And these are my ROMs. For the Atari 2600, but it also organizes some of them into like, hey, here's a bunch of hacks and homebrew stuff that people have put out there, and I do have a bunch of these. I downloaded like a collection of them. If you, we won't talk about where to get ROMs necessarily, but I'll say there are places
there will be no links to ROMs in this video.
But I will say that you can find really cool work out there, all kinds of archives of people who've made Atari 2600 games, years later, right? Like someone made a joke recreation of Halo for the Atari 2600, and things like that. So obviously,
I've been following this group called Champ Games, and they make like arcade quality video games for the Atari 2600.
Wow,
it's amazing. I don't know how they do it. And I've been trying to kind of play with my DS. My DS of all my systems is the only one that can get those homebrew high-end Champ games to work. And that's a MAME thing, but it's amazing what some of these developers are doing for Atari 2600. Just crazy.
Yeah. So that's sort of one example here. And so it's laying these out as the way RetroArch would expect them. So I can go in my RetroArch on my computer, and it has a setting for where do you store your ROMs. And I can just point it to this folder on the network, and it will scan them. And now it'll take a while to scan all my ROMs, but it can scan them and just be like, great, these are all the games you have. And again, this is a full list of everything. I don't have games in a lot of the, like, I'm currently actually Nintendo 64 is on my, I do have some Nintendo 64 ROMs, but I haven't added them to RetroNAS yet. I'm currently in the process of moving my stuff from what I was doing before over to this. But it's really cool. Or I can look at, well, okay, what would that look like on the Mister? So the Mister share it made, it actually has a place, I guess it does present BIOS files here, that's interesting. Sure. And it has a folder for games, and you can even configure the Mister to store its saves here, which is a really great way to back them up, right? So now they're on my home server where I don't have to worry about, maybe I mess up my Mister and I have to wipe it and start it over. That's fine. My game saves are still here, which is really cool.
Yeah. So can I ask you, Taylor, with these game folders, you have the Mister, you have the RetroArch, you have the Analog Pocket. So The idea, though, is the ROMs are copied into each of these different systems, right?
No,
Or do the ROMs centralize? Okay, no,
their
good.
ROMs are centralized. Yeah, so that's the magic of this. Is I have one. I didn't, and I haven't really shown this. Let's use NES because I'm pretty sure I have an NES collection. Yep, my NES collection's already here. So this is an example. This is the universal ROM folder. RetroNAS called it. This is where I put the ROMs, and it's got these folders. It's organized them into for me, but you don't have to have it do this. You could do it a different way if you want to. But
Got
you
it.
can see all of these folders it's made. If I go over to Mister and then Games and then NES, which in this case it just has a capital NES folder is what it wants. My ROMs are right here. It's
So
the
it
same
doesn't
set.
care what it wants. It's just sim linking to the folder that you tell it to, or does it know?
It knows. I didn't have to set these sim links up.
Wow.
That's the magic of it for me is I don't have to maintain, well, where does this device want these same ROMs? And it that's what the RetroNAS project is doing for me is I don't have to maintain that. I don't even have to set up the sim links. It will just do it. And another the same set, same library of ROMs here. If I in Analog Pocket assets, and I believe it's just NES. Yep, and Analog Pocket has a weird layout where it's NES common, and then you put your ROMs in there. So it's done that. Now, Analog Pocket doesn't have Wi-Fi or networking. So
Yeah.
what I would do with this is I would plug in the SD card of my Analog Pocket into my computer and simply copy these folders right over to it.
Hmm.
Right. But
Sure.
it makes it so much easier. I don't have to. Before I was copying like 36 individual folders, and then eventually I
Absolutely.
did the
Yeah.
rsync thing, right? But like
Yeah.
this is way faster for me to maintain. So that's the main reason why I started using this or looking into this. But it also does some other things that I find really impressive too, which we can talk about unless you got more ROM collection things you want to chat.
No, no. I mean, that's the main. When I read your post, the main attraction for me was ROM organization because I have many, many across many, many devices, or not many, many, but several devices, and it's a pain because I don't
Mm-hmm.
know what's where, and I start to lose, like, or chase my tail, or lose the narrative, if you will. So this is huge. So yeah, I'd love to know what else it can do.
Well, and you also get into the situation of like, oh, my ROM collection for this system only lives on a SD card on this device,
Yeah,
and I forgot and I actually wiped that thing.
yeah,
I've done
exactly.
that, and then had to go recollect those ROMs or maybe find a backup I made or something. But usually I don't have like I'm not real diligent about these types of things. So
No.
yeah, so what else can it do? So the other things, and I'm just going to share my whole screen just so we can look at a few different things, but I'll try to make stuff visible. But the other things it can do, and I did blog this, is it runs old networking protocols in some cases extremely old. And so this is really cool if you're into retro computing. One thing that I ran into with the stuff we've done with Windows 95 and the Mister is it's just hard to get files onto Windows 95 in this day and age, especially if you're emulating an old operating system. Because if you have a real computer you're running Windows 95 on, and you could do things like get a USB floppy drive and put files on a floppy from a modern computer, and then put that floppy into your retro computer given given its floppy drive works. That works. But if you're emulating this, I can't plug like a floppy drive into my Mister. That's just not a thing that I can do. Or maybe I can, but I don't know how to. um, um, so you have to come up with creative ways to shuttle files around. And often networking is a good way, even though they're ancient OSs in some cases way older than Windows 95. This will run a lot of those. And the great thing about that is um, it's on an isolated device that doesn't have, a bunch of other sensitive information on it, right? It's just a ROM collection and stuff for retro computing specifically. I, as I mentioned, do run a home server for keeping some files and things around. I would never want to put some of these old networking protocols on that server because it's not great from a security standpoint to do that. This is a dedicated and relatively safe way to do that, because you're running it on a device it's not connecting to the internet in other meaningful ways. Just your local network. So this I haven't messed with as much, but on the Wikipedia page, on the GitHub wiki for RetroNAS, they have a sidebar of all of the protocols and things it supports. So you can set up a web server. Okay, sure. You can set up file transfer, so FTP. You can set up a floppy emulation service over the network, which I'm not 100% sure how that works, but my understanding is that you would install a little program on a DOS system and run it, and it will emulate floppies over the network, which is really interesting. You can run a network share, so in some cases that will work. You can run old versions of AppleTalk, which is for like the Macintosh and that era of Apple computers, like 80s and early 90s Apple. All kinds of things. You can run Telnet on here. There's a Gopher server that I want to mess with. Gopher, like the pre-internet. I'm from Wisconsin, so I always think of Gopher in relation to University of Minnesota, where it started. And that's why it's called Gopher. And it's not really used anymore, but technically still exists. There's even clients, I think. But yeah,
you could be one.
What'd you say?
You could be one.
Yeah, I could. I should try to get my blog on the GopherNet.
There you go. That would be radical.
Next generation containerized Gopher hosting on Reclaim Cloud. Anyway, so it talks all of these protocols so that if you have a retro computing device or emulation and you want to get files around, this may help you. Now this gets into even more setup, right? Because just turning on like AppleTalk does nothing for you. You have to also get your old Apple computer on your home network, and maybe it has Ethernet built in, depending on how new it is. Like if it's 90s era, probably. But if it's 80s era, you may need to have other hardware to get on a local network in the first place, right? So This isn't just that straightforward, but I'm pretty sure I could do things like connect to this from my Mister's emulated systems in some ways, if because those often have bridges to get on your network. In the case of Windows 95, it has an emulated dial-up bridge where you dial up in Windows 95, but it's actually connecting you to Wi-Fi. So that's sort of like a driver someone made.
Which is cool.
So anyway, it also has a bunch of other system configurations. So I showed the little shares for my Mister, Analog Pocket, and RetroArch. But there are other ones. EmuDeck. This is software for running emulation on a Steam Deck. Batocera, right on the list. So it supports Batocera directly. I want to say, what's the other one I thought was interesting here? Oh, it's got like supported shares for like Xbox 360's homebrew. So I have an old Xbox 360 that I haven't done this with yet, but I want to learn how to mod it and run unauthorized software on there. Kind of as like a soldering project that I can do and learn.
Explain this to me. So Batocera works with this, and what we're talking about, because when I put my Batocera on, I can network connect with my Mac easily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's pretty easy. What does this offer you beyond that?
So in this case, so I'm looking at their wiki. So they are. It looks like you can have, instead of connecting to Batocera from another device, you can
Yeah.
set up Batocera to connect to your RetroNAS to read your ROM collection from that directly instead of the other way
Gotcha.
around.
So Batocera automatically checks it. So I don't have to go into the Batocera directly from the Mac. It will automatically check the NAS.
Yeah, and it looks like they said, to set this up, they tell you to refer to the official documentation, but basically you go into a text file, you change share device to network, and then you put in some settings here that you say, here's where my RetroNAS is, basically, and it will go and check ROMs, BIOS, and it'll also back up saves there, which is cool. Now, the disadvantage to all of this, right, is you need your RetroNAS running all of the time for this to work. So if you have a RetroNAS thing and you're like, oh, I turn it on sometimes, or you unplug it for whatever reason, and you turn on your device running Batocera, it's going to try and connect to RetroNAS to load your ROM library, and it won't be able to, right? So that's why it's really great for solving the problem we've outlined. But if you're like, I only have one of these things, well, I don't know, maybe just copy your ROMs to it. That's probably simpler. But if you're jumping between a few different devices from now and then, this upfront work is worth it in a lot of cases, in my opinion.
Gotcha.
So there's other things it can do too. It also can run a few network services right on there. So you can actually, it can do proxying for the web. This is one thing I want to mess with is you can run a Wayback Proxy. This is like what I did at Reclaim Open, where you can proxy the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine and device and pages from certain years into a browser.
Sure.
Which is really cool. It also has a different kind of proxy where this one I find really interesting. This is called Web 1, and it's a proxy designed to allow older Web 1.0 clients to work in a Web 2.0 world. And so basically it strips HTTPS and certain types of JavaScript off of web pages so that they can be viewable on really old browsers.
Isn't that what the one you did for Reclaim Open? Wasn't that kind of what you did?
It did for Reclaim Open. It was going and getting old copies of web pages from the Internet Archive directly. So you're looking at Yahoo from 1997, whereas this would go and get a current website and hack it up essentially, and then deliver it. Now, how is that useful? I don't know, but I think it's kind of cool. I mean, this isn't really about useful. It's about hobby projects.
None of this is useful.
Yeah. So this is similar, but it's a way to view the modern web on an old web browser. And I find that kind of interesting. And this was actually something I wanted to do. I thought an interesting follow-up to this, to the what I did at Reclaim Open would be like blog showcases, but on an old browser. And don't get me wrong, this is like 20% of an idea, so it's not really good yet. But I thought it'd be kind of cool to be like, yeah, showcase your work, but it's on an ancient machine and with an ancient browser, just to drive home the point that the web is the platform in a lot of ways. And
accessibility is key.
Yes. So there's a few things like that. It has, it does have a thing called sync thing, which is for synchronizing files. This would be more for like, if you had a device that you didn't want it to connect directly to the RetroNAS, but you wanted it to essentially periodically check in sync files. Now that I think about it, sync thing could be a way to run two RetroNASs in sync with each other. Maybe. I haven't looked into it. And then this is one I'm using called ROM import, which basically it's a script that you run. You drop your ROMs in a folder and it will go organize them for you, which I found really cool. So all of this though, this is not all super, like in my case, I'm running this as a virtual machine on a server I'm already running for another purpose. So I basically set up a virtual machine and then went through their install guide, which was pretty simple. Relatively, but you can run it on all kinds of devices. You can run this on a Raspberry Pi. You mentioned running on a Raspberry Pi Zero. I think that could work. What I don't know is the Raspberry Pi Zero have enough oomph to run all this?
Yeah.
Probably, because this isn't really doing that much it's just serving files for the most part. But if you were trying to do something with this and you have a Raspberry Pi laying around, that's probably where I would start with it. And then from there, you're basically SSHing into it, or you can set up a web-based management for it, which it basically is just going to give you a special web page to go to, and then you're still using the command line. So it's in a lot of ways the same experience. I'm just using SSH directly. But basically, you SSH into this thing, you type RetroNAS, which is a program on there, and it will whoops. Hold on.
You're SSHing onto your server.
Yes. It's what
Are you using Cockpit or no?
I'm not using Cockpit because again, all Cockpit really it seemed like, I haven't tried it, I guess, but it seemed like all Cockpit did was expose the terminal as a web page I could go to. It's behind a password and everything, but I was like, I am fine with SSHing in directly. So then you run this RetroNAS program, and you have to put in your password you've set up for it. And then you get this kind of, it's still a terminal thing, but it's at least, here, let me,
yeah.
I don't know if this is going to work that well, but anyway, you get this little menu interface. And so this, is relatively easy to use. Like, it'll tell you, here's your IP address, and you can go in here and change your password. So while there's some know-how needed to get started with this, you don't really have to be like a sysadmin to use this thing. It walks you through. The only commands I've typed in a RetroNAS is to log into it, basically, and from there you can go to an install menu, and this is where you can set up different services, right? So I went in and installed the Samba for Mister, which is to install that network share. Batocera's in here. There's all kinds of things. The ROM import tool I installed in here. There's a lot of stuff I haven't even explored yet. I find this interesting. Samba for Amiga. Apparently, you can use an old Commodore Amiga on the network, and
wow.
I find that fascinating because that's Amiga and computer systems older than Amiga are like where I never used them. Like most of my oldest computing memories are from like DOS and Windows. So I find that stuff like exotic in a way that's kind of interesting. Sure. There's some basic tools to check if services are running, basically. I can go into the tools menu and run scripts that they've set up. So this is that ROM import thing I was talking about. So I can go in here, go to ROM import, and then I can go and say, yes, I've got ROMs for this system. And what I would then do, this is going to be so small to see on the way I'm sharing my screen, but I'll just have to describe it. I would then go into my RetroNAS share. There's a folder called ROM import, and I would just throw my ROM files in there and run this tool, and it would pick up the name of each, or it would pick up each ROM by its content and sort it into the correct system directory for me, which I find really cool.
Really? So it's ROM by ROM.
Yeah, and it's actually using file hashes. So it's using the content of the file to determine what ROM is what. So it doesn't matter how you've named it in theory.
Wow.
So that's really interesting. And the main thing for me is I really like the way it sorts it. So I showed this a little bit. This may literally be easier for me to show via the terminal. So let me actually do that. Because I can actually blow this up a little bit. So what I really like is that ROM import tool does this sorting for me, where it basically it makes these, you know, US, Europe, Japan folders for me. And oh, these are aftermarket ROMs you have, and tools and betas, and it sorts all that. And I find that really fascinating, because normally what I had before was a big pile of ROMs, and it
Totally.
would be like Super Mario Brothers release 1 US, Super Mario Brothers Japan release
Yeah.
version 2, you know. And it's like, I mean, I kind of, it's neat, but most of the time it would be much easier for me to just look at the one version of the game. I don't really care in a lot of cases what, you know. um Now I'm doing this on a little, you know what I should do is install this stuff. So yeah, okay, so here we go. So so this makes it really really kind of cool to look through my collection really easily. And you know, it's got these are all the US ROMs specifically, which is normally what I'm caring about, right?
Yeah.
So I find that import tool and the shares stuff that we've already talked about just super worth it. And to the point where I already mentioned, I already had a home server. I already had a strategy for syncing ROMs, but seeing how this worked, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna run this separate from all of that, specifically because this tool can help me manage some of it. Now,
Yeah.
it's not a
That's
magic bullet.
super cool.
Yeah, it's not a magic. Yeah, for sure. It's not a magic bullet. You still have to set it up. You have to set it up. Crucially, my next step is to set it up on my devices, to set it to connect here. But it's got that wiki page, you know, on their GitHub. You just go and say, I'm looking to use this with a with Batocera, and it's got some documentation for you. It's not the most robust documentation, but it should get you there, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I wonder, I just, obviously it's a matter of just testing, but like, what would my 3DS, like, you know, homebrew, how would that work? Like, it would be interesting
Yeah.
just to test it out.
Yeah, and you know, it's not going to support every single emulator or whatever and how it wants it. So I'm not 100% sure what that looks like. Now I know there's references to 3DS for QR codes. I don't even know what this is.
Yeah, I bet you. I wonder if you use QR codes to link. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, the original.
But you know, there's videos for a lot of this stuff, so you can see demos of what it looks like.
Yeah, that's cool. No, I mean,
Yeah.
I am definitely going to play around with this. Yeah, there it is. Use the QR code to install the software on your 3DS, which I did, you know, when I was getting into homebrew. So
Okay.
there's got to be some link to that.
Yeah, interesting. So, you know, now what software is my question? Like, can I use it to bring ROMs over somehow, or is it for other
Yeah,
purposes?
there's this
you know?
software called CIA. If you go
Okay.
up, which is one of the things they're using.
Okay.
I think that's what you would use.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I that's not a thing I mess with, so I have no idea. But that's cool. So I like that it's, you know, collecting a lot of these services. Some of them I've heard of before in some cases, but in one kind of I think of it as like a software appliance. It's one thing I install, and it has its own updates that it runs, and it's maintained by a bunch of different people. And I can basically go, this thing likely solves a lot of my needs for retro computing in one place. And so there's one place I can go. I'm not like I'll never need another piece of software again for these things, but I will say it's replaced all of the ones I was using up until now in a way that I find really interesting. So
it's really cool. I appreciate you linking to it and you writing about it, because I can really see the value of, you know, playing with it, which is always the real fun. But then also like syncing a couple of my systems now, especially since I'm using Batocera, Achera, and RetroPie, which are essentially the same kind of tool. You know, what I put on Batocera, then I'm wondering, oh, did I update for RetroPie? Like, this would solve that, right?
Yeah.
Boom. And then, you know, all my ancillary stuff, you know, I have 2 RetroPies, and then I have, you know, a 3DS. If that can happen, you know, then it's like you have, you know, what do they call it? Like, you're kind of archival official versions of all your ROMs,
Yeah.
and then you can always go back to that. You know what I mean?
Well,
Like that's your kind of starting point.
yeah, exactly. In my view, like I'm likely to have devices that don't fit into this sort of ecosystem perfectly, right? For my
Yeah,
case, I mentioned this little tiny handheld I have, the Miu Mini. It's not specifically supported on this as a share, but if I can offload me not having to maintain the Mister side of things and in these other
yeah,
devices, my Steam Deck, I didn't even mention I have a Steam Deck too, and I've
yeah,
never done emulation on it, but I would love to set that up. Up until now, I haven't because I didn't want to mess with it basically. But now that having ROMs is kind of on there is somewhat a solved problem, I might.
yeah.
Um,
I
so
agree.
it's cool, and it will make even my devices that don't fit into this easier to maintain because it's like, okay, but it's still organized, and I really just have to go. Do I want to play NES games on this device? Okay, I've got a perfect folder for that. It's organized. Maybe I only want to copy my US ROMs to it because that's a small folder compared to the entire library of every single ROM that I have, you know.
I
So
agree.
it's something I'm really excited about, and I think it's gonna stick in my setup anyway. So, and I've heard it. You know, RetroNAS has been around for not that long, but a couple years. But there's a YouTube video I linked on my blog that's a good showcase of it. But to be perfectly honest, maybe I didn't watch close enough. I just didn't get it. The way they explained it, I was like, this is just a network storage. Like I have network storage. Why would I care? And what I didn't understand was that this is network storage that automatically handles the organization across different platforms for you in a way, in some ways. So exciting stuff.
It is. It's great. So yeah, I'll play around with it and I'll report back. But thanks
Sounds
for
good.
doing this. Thanks for taking me through it. This is a really good kind of look to what I'm getting myself into.
Yeah, yeah. And so I guess before we sign off, maybe we should maybe shout out kind of what we're up to in the next couple weeks here. I'm gonna bring up our events calendar because we do have some streams upcoming. Um, and real quick, because we are out of time, but I would be remiss. So anyway, next Friday we've got we're talking with folks from MSU about the knowledge columns, which is knowledge comments, which is really exciting. It's not the first time. I think it's the first time on Reclaim TV we might have talked to them, but it's not the first time that we as a company have been following what it used to be the humanities commons. Um,
Yeah, the
and
work they're doing there is great. You
it's
know,
amazing stuff. So
with
I
WordPress, Mastodon, I mean, the whole thing, and just kind of an alternative to, academia.edu or whatever that is. Like, I just really love Kathleen Fitzpatrick and that whole crew and what they're doing. So,
yeah,
yes,
really exciting.
definitely check in on that. Good work
And
getting them to sit down and talk with you.
yeah, I think that's that. I mean, I have not been. I think that's mostly been Pilot's organization there. So it's really
It's
cool stuff.
awesome. Great.
Um, and then at the end
Kudos,
of the month,
Pilot.
yeah. And at the end of the month, we're talking. You are sitting down with Audrey Waters to talk about blogging. It looks like.
Yeah, writing and blogging and some of her stuff she's been doing recently. And this is the kind of year of the blog at Reclaim 2025. We have a blogging initiative called Bloggers Anonymous, where we'll have meetings once a month where if you can come and say, hey, my name is Jim Groom. I'm a blogger. And everyone says, hi, Jim. And then at that point, you talk about all your struggles with blogging and blogging about blogging and not blogging or blogging too much or blogging get in the way of your family life, all of these things and more. So this is kicking it off. We'll also be talking with Ken Lane, Mike Caulfield, Tom Woodward, and Amy Collier. All sorts of good stuff coming up in February too. But Audrey Waters, I mean, no better way to kick it off than with Hack Education. And all the work she's done. Talk about a writer in the field.
Yeah.
She is epic. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's gonna be a really exciting one. And just you already covered it, but I'll just mention too if you want to learn more about the Bloggers Anonymous and the community of practice we're kicking
Yeah.
off here. Marin has a blog post at blog.reclaimhosting.com, of course. And so you should check that out. talks about how you can participate and what to look forward to. So it's an exciting year. We're kicking off a bunch of new things. And thanks for tuning in. If you did live or later, to our very specific emulation Reclaim TV.
This was niche video, if we will. We're gonna get more broad with blogging and writing, but this was as niche as it gets.
We gotta start niche, and well, you know, that's okay, because we're gonna be trying to make room this year to pull in all kinds of folks and talk about all kinds of interesting things. So we got to get our weird stuff out of the way sometimes too.
Absolutely. You know? It's got to be some weirdness, right? Otherwise, it's not the web. And some freak out there will find it useful, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Well, I'm going to hit the stop button here in a second, and thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Everybody.